G'day everyone, it's Helen Godden here from Australia, and I'm with Handi Quilter today as the ambassador of the Sweet 16, and this little segment is called Short and Sweet. We're going to look at today a doodle diary. I'm sure you've heard it before, but when you're learning your quilting, it's all about practicing on paper first and practicing those shapes until you've got them well and truly in your muscle memory on paper so you can take those designs to your machine. So a doodle diary is something like this, where we keep track of our ideas and our designs and keep practicing them in our book. But this is not very inspiring, is it? Let's make a cover for our doodle diary. So what I'm going to show you today is a cover I've made for this one, but I've painted it with some of my favourite acrylic paint. So you can see here I've started to paint this one and then stitch into it. So including my quilting designs on the front cover of my doodle diary, so why not? I've got the recipe here, let's call it a recipe, for how to make a doodle diary. And I've got 20 inches of fabric, which are then folded over to suit my book. Now my book is 5 by 8 inches, so it depends on the size of your book. I've folded that over. I then put the batting inside, and I did some painting, and then we turn those sides back to make the little slip in for the doodle diary. So that'll go in there, and then eventually we'll sew this side. So we'll make a little doodle diary like that. Okay, so I'm going to show you today a bit more about how I stitch onto the acrylic paint. This is acrylic paint on here. This is Lumiere is the brand I like to use. I use a lot of this in my painting on my quilts. Because for me it's not about doing the piecing or indeed the sewing of the doodle diary. I want to get to the quilting as quickly as possible. So I paint the surface of a lot of my quilts so that I can get to the quilting part, which to me is the really fun bit. So this paint is an acrylic base and I paint over black fabric, and this paint has got a lot of metallic and pearlescent sheen, so these colours stand out beautifully on that black surface. Then when it comes to stitching, I tend to use the black thread because it stands out really nicely against the shiny pearlescent colours. But there's a few things to remember when you're stitching on the acrylic. It does, for one thing, you'll notice when I stitch, it'll make quite a different sound. The needle punching through the surface of the paint now has a funny little puck, puck, puck sound, if you like. It's because the needle is actually piercing this plasticky surface of the painted acrylic paint. So the machine will sound different and you'll think something's not quite right with the machine. It's actually just the needle punching through that acrylic paint. The other thing that'll happen is that your stitches will appear a little bit straighter on the surface, because unlike normal fabric where the stitch can sink down into the fabric and into the batting, etc., with the acrylic sort of being a bit of a barrier on the fabric, that stitch won't sink in quite the same. So you might end up adjusting your tension, thinking that the stitch is too straight on the surface. It's just the difference between quilting on unpainted fabric to painted fabric. I also, with most of my quilts, will always opt for the black thread on top of my painted surface, because it does give me excellent contrast between the colours and the the thread patterning that I'm making. I also find that if you were to match your thread, say putting a coppery or an orangey colour on here, what happens is the orange thread will sink into the colour of the paint and disappear, and all you're left with is these black holes. Because of the painted surface, the needle will pierce that hole, but the hole will not close over. It'll stay quite open as a black hole. Even if you were to rub it or anything, you won't lose that black hole. So if you're just using the matching coloured thread, visually all you see is a series of holes, which isn't particularly attractive. So I recommend you go with your black thread. By the same token, there's no unpicking or reverse sewing when you're working on painted surface, because you cannot remove those little black pinholes again. So that's just some general advice on sewing on acrylic. I'm going to do some stitching now, and you'll hear the sound the machine will make. So we'll take that diary out for now. And I haven't, of course, sewn over that last little flap there because we need to be able to get in here to do our quilting. So on this orange area here, I've started what I call contour stippling, where I've stitched one large exaggerated stipple right the way across that area, and then I am repeating it and exaggerating that shape as I go. It ends up looking a bit like the contours of an aerial map, or it might even look like the stone called agate that has those patterns through it. You might have a different name for it. Let's have a look at that one. Now just listen for the different sound the machine will make. You might not be able to pick that up, but I can hear a little pucker pucker sound as the needle actually goes through the paint, so it does sound a little bit different. I'll do a bit more. You also might be able to see those stitches are quite flat. They look quite straight on top of the surface. They don't look like they're sinking down into the fabric. And you can see there is quite a large hole left by the needle, even though I'm sure we've got a pretty average sized needle in here. That hole will not close over like it normally does in normal quilting or sewing. So you are left with those holes. That just becomes part of the look of the whole piece. So that was some contour stippling there. We'll try a different design in the next one. I'm thinking I might show you how I do a spider's web in this area here. So you can see I've put all the spokes or the arms of the spider's web, and I've tried to finish in the middle there, and now I'm going to do a continuous spiral around those spokes to create the little web for our spider. Now, it wouldn't be complete without a little spider in there, would it? There we go. Now if I had my red Sharpie or marker with me, I'd put a little red dot there because he's got to be a red back, because he's Australian, of course. So there we go. It's the only kind of spider I like, is one that I've drawn myself. So yes, he's got 8 legs, so he's definitely a spider. So now we've got different options here of different patterns we could put in these areas. What are we going to try next? We might put a nice big spiral in this one. I'm going to go around the outside first, around the ditch effectively of that shape, and then put a spiral into it. Now, as you can see, I've left myself lots of space on that spiral. I kept it quite open and wide. So now on my way out, I can add perhaps a different pattern, something a little bit fancy. This one I call Dragon's Tail. Maybe for this one we'll do a bit of a sunburst in here. So looking back at this one, it actually looks more like an orange or a lemon rather than a sunburst. So there we go. How about I try now some abstract spirals? This is a fun one. What you can see with that one is that sometimes there's not enough room for a whole spiral, so I just did some lines and shapes that look like those spirals continue underneath that other shape, rather than trying to squeeze another whole spiral in. So I call that let there be half, or let there be half a spiral. This one I'm going to call squared off, and it's a geometric kind of design where all the lines that I'm going to stitch are going to be either horizontal or vertical. So you sort of keep everything in that one format, and you start to draw a square, but then over complete that square and move on to the next one. It'll make more sense on here. So I've just worked my way around that whole area, but keeping everything horizontal and vertical, making partial squares, overlapping squares. That's quite a fun one. And we've got a bit of space in here. How about I do a bit of showing off now, and I'll show you a little bit of Aussie quilting. There we go, we've got some kangaroos jumping across there. This is very much Australian colours of the green and gold. So some little skippies. Of course every Australian can actually quilt that, it's part of genetically, we can do that, it's true. No, it's not. Okay. I then probably would fill all that background area with some stippling and finish that off, and then it's a matter of sewing that last piece under there so that it will fit onto our doodle diary. There we go. That's going to be a lot more inspiring for us to do some practicing for our next quilting adventure, with a little spider there to be careful of, and our kangaroos, and a bit of inspiration there. So that's stitching over that acrylic paint. It's one of my favourite things to do. I love the effect and how it really shows off the stitching. So you might like to give that a try and create your own doodle diary to practice in. So I'll see you very soon. See you later. Bye.